Good morning. My name is Jim Pearson. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at Alzheimer's Scotland, and on this call with me today we have...
Hello, I'm Joanna Boddy and I'm a member of the National Dementia Carers Action Network.
I'm Elaine Deehan. Good morning. I'm also a member of the National Dementia Carers Action Network. I've looked after Mum at home and now she's in nursing home.
Good morning, and thank you, and good morning everyone. This is a short podcast just to have an exploration and discussion around some of the issues that arise in people's experiences of paying for care when someone moves to live in a care home. There's no doubt, I think, Elaine and Joanna, that the decision about someone moving to live in a care home is without a doubt one of the most difficult for the individual themselves and for their families to take, and that can be a difficult emotional time. You know, it's a sense of loss and perhaps even bereavement for people when that decision happens. So often that might be driven by a period of crisis as well. So it's a decision that's often taken in an already challenging time. And I suppose one of the issues that can make that even more anxious is this whole issue about paying for care. So at that point, most people would go through what's called a financial assessment process, and that process is is part of a national legal framework. There's a series of national legislation around that called the National Assistance Assessment and Resources Regulations, and they tell authorities how to carry those financial assessments out. It's quite a complex process, and it's one where people have a lot of anxiety about what they're going to pay, and that process is designed to determine how much someone pays as a contribution towards the cost of their care, or indeed if they're self-funding. And it's that part of that process I wanted to kind of explore with you both today, just around your own experience of that. So can I just ask you both maybe to say a wee bit about that? You've been through that process of making a decision about somebody close to you moving into a care home and maybe going through that financial assessment process. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like for you?
I don't mind going first. I'm going through that process at the moment. We looked after Mum for 3 years until, as you say, Jim, we ended up in crisis. My husband's brother died. He had to go urgently over to Algeria to see his brother. So I was on my own with Mum and really struggling, couldn't get anybody to help. My sister managed for a day. So by the time my husband came back, I was at breaking point. So Mum ended up going into urgent respite and didn't come out after that. We finally made the decision with the social workers that it would be in our best interests. I hadn't appreciated how ill we were going to feel looking after her, how difficult it would be. I'm a nurse, so I had no idea how difficult it was looking after somebody. It's very difficult when you're in that situation. So at the time she went into residential care, which wasn't right for her. Mm-hmm. Really. Mum was very, very active. She moved into a care home where there was a huge staircase. She was up and down there like a yo-yo, in and out everybody's rooms, just generally causing lots of trouble and problems. Had lots and lots of falls. Mm. And then she'd been out and in lots of places during respite and had failed lots of places that said that we couldn't manage her because she was just so active. So she then ended up going into a specialist dementia unit, and that was quite an upheaval for everybody. We'd had to make that decision that she definitely wasn't going back to that nursing home after a huge fall. So she was in there about a year and then moved back to a nursing home. Mm. So during all that time, initially we weren't told very much about financial assessment. It was just like, sign here, you know. We didn't really, and I still don't completely understand what's all involved. Legally it's very difficult, I think, for I've just heard you mention an act that I wasn't aware of, which I should be being in NDCAN, but it's quite interesting how it all comes about. And I think the social workers at the time do their best, but they're so pulled in 20 different directions that they don't have time to sit with families and explain it all. And I think sometimes they don't completely understand either.
Yeah, my experience is kind of slightly different from Elaine's. My mum died 3 years ago, but I supported her at home. Things did come to crisis, and Mum ended up in hospital and then in a specialist dementia unit, which was an enormously difficult time for us all, I think. But reached a point where she was felt not to require that level of care and could move to nursing home. And one of the issues about that was just the pressure to move her from hospital, because it's that famous situation of being seen as a delayed discharge or a bed blocker or whatever kind of language, which is really not pleasant language, but kind of pressure. So the pressure was around finding somewhere that we felt was suitable for her, was right, but under a real time pressure. My background, I was a social worker, so I'd had experience in using the charging policy, and I knew how complex it was. And I knew also just, and was always concerned about the impact it had on people and lots of the difficulties that people faced as a result. I knew that Mum would be self-funding. I had enough knowledge to know that that would be the situation, and really looked for the care home on that kind of basis. But you were also trying to deal with all of that emotional baggage of what that actually means, and of that feeling of, are you doing the right thing, and is this the right place, and how do you make that choice? And when I started looking, I realised the place that I thought was best for Mum, and which was nearest to me and seemed to work and certainly seemed to cater for her particular needs and cater for people with dementia, was quite an expensive place. And therefore, and we were lucky because Mum was self-funding and therefore could do that. But I was quite shocked, despite my experience and background, at realising the cost of care. And how much that would impact. And so I think no matter what your background is and what your knowledge is, it still comes as a shock, and just realising the differences in cost and the difference between self-funding and if you're not self-funding. And the other thing for me was around free nursing care, which Mum would be eligible for, but in fact that hadn't really changed particularly. I was retired by this stage, but it hadn't really changed particularly since I'd left work, despite the cost of care. So I think trying to deal with all of that information, even if you have a background and some knowledge, is enormously difficult.
Did either of you have any help with that, with the financial assessment? Were you offered any help? Did you seek any advice about it?
Not particularly. I have to say the experience of the assessment and support was not particularly great. I probably was fortunate. I did have some other resources and kind of contacts, friends who I'd worked with and people I'd worked with who were able to support me with that and kind of assist. So I was probably in a more fortunate situation than many people, but I've certainly supported a friend who had to make the decision about her husband going into care, and she was in a total panic because she was really given so little information and couldn't really make sense of what was happening. And I kind of ended up really trying to help her in terms of that financial assessment, because the support for her was not there. As Elaine said, services are under such pressure, and because it is complex. And I don't think, because it is complex, I'm not sure that staff always understand it. And therefore sometimes the kind of advice is not perhaps the best because they're not very sure. I didn't know where I could go for help if I needed to do that, but felt my own resources, and I was fortunate in having those resources.
Yeah. And I think, like yourself, I got help from friends that had been through the system, and understood how it all worked. That was where I got my support from. So, yeah, very difficult.
Yeah, Elaine, you said earlier you're going through this process at the moment. Do you mean, are you still in the middle?
My mum's still self-funding at the moment, so still going through the process. And you know, when I moved up from England to look after my mum, I had no idea that was the situation. Otherwise, I may have been tempted to bring her down there. I always thought care in Scotland was free, because there's this talk of the free nursing care, which isn't free at all, as we know. So there's only a very small element. Mum's nursing home fees are £3,700 a month. And I think for any family to sustain that, that's a lot of money over even a 6-month period. It's a huge amount of money. So your money very quickly goes.
Is that after the free personal nursing care?
That's including the free personal nursing care. That's the total amount that we pay.
Right.
Yeah.
And can I ask that, and when, because one of the things that people often tell us when they're self-funding is that when you start to look at the care homes that are available, sometimes the care home will ask for the person to confirm or to sign an agreement that whatever those rates are, they would pay those level of rates for a minimum period of time. And that can sometimes be 1 or 2, sometimes more.
Yeah.
years. Did that happen?
Yeah, that certainly happened for me. I was asked to confirm that mum would be able to fund her place for at least 2 years.
Okay.
Now, I was mum's power of attorney, so I was clear, and I was very clear that it was mum who was paying. It wasn't me, and I think that sometimes if you don't have that knowledge, to be clear about that, that's where people can be under difficulties. But I had to confirm that she could fund her place herself for at least 2 years. I can't remember whether I think that was part of the contract. I can't quite remember, but certainly had to confirm that.
Was that as a condition of getting the place?
Yeah. And I think that was to do with the model. The care home had a model where I think they felt they could only have a certain number of people who are funded at local authority rates, and therefore probably the majority of the residents were in fact self-funding.
Okay.
And that raises that whole other issue, because I have to say it was an excellent care home. It was a great care home, cared for mum extremely well, supported us very well, and I could understand where the money was going, because they had good staff and supported it. But the reality is that that's not a facility that is available to everybody.
Yeah.
Because of that, and that's, I think, that's another thing which is about the inequity of this and about ensuring people get the right care in the right place.
So you mentioned something there which is quite interesting. That was about you being really clear that this was an agreement between your mum and the care home, and while you were signing as a power of attorney, you were signing that agreement on her behalf. But there is that other side of that is that sometimes we've also heard that care homes will not only ask the person to sign to confirm that they will remain self-funded, but will sometimes seek a guarantor, which means that they'll ask a third party, usually a family member, to sign and take on some liability in the same way that you might be a guarantor for someone who takes out a personal loan, to assume some liability that you otherwise wouldn't have, to pick up those fees if that person's unable to pay.
I was very aware of that, and kind of knew of situations where that had happened, and kind of in a later point in mum's time in the care home was very aware for other people of the impact of their financial circumstances changing, people then not being able to fund their placement, and what that might mean for the person being able to remain in the care home. So yes, I knew. And I knew that I knew mum could fund that for 2 years, so that wasn't an issue for me. There was a niggle at the back of my mind: what happens kind of beyond that, and what does that mean? I've certainly known of other people, and when I was working, I was very aware that people were being asked to pay additional fees for additional things, and it was the family that were being asked. It wasn't from an individual's funds. And knew in my head that I knew that wasn't correct and that people shouldn't be asked for that. But you're in a very difficult situation, and I think the real difficulty is if you found somewhere that you feel is good for your relative and is working well, then the whole trauma of thinking, particularly for somebody with dementia who doesn't deal with change particularly well, is if I don't pay this, does that mean my relative has to move?
Yeah.
And the trauma for the family, but also trauma for that individual of what that means, I think that's an enormous pressure on people.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think another point, Jim, I was living down in England. As I say, I was down there for 24 years. So I was in a very good job. I was working as a ward manager. And I made that decision to come up and move up to Scotland to look after Mum because she was on her own. My dad had died sort of 3 years earlier. She'd had dementia when my father died, was diagnosed way back in 2011, 2012, something like that. And it was clear she wasn't managing. The neighbours kept phoning me, and I was coming up every possible weekend trying to run about cutting the grass and all these jobs. So I made that decision to come up. So we had to sell our home down south, move into Mum's home. So we're now in the situation where we're living in Mum's home, and that will have to be sold to pay for her care. So we're now in a very difficult situation financially. We're all right at the moment, but in the future, it's something that I have to think about. So I've had to take early pension. I'm still working part-time, but I had to take my early pension because I had very little income when I was looking after Mum. So it's all those things and how it affects families, very much so.
When in the financial assessment, was your mum's home included as part of her capital?
Yes, yeah.
And have you asked for that to be disregarded in any way?
No.
No, okay. So there are, I mean, the whole issue about property is pretty complex, and it's one of the things I think that creates most anxiety for people is the fact that the home may count as part of their capital. They may have to sell their home in order to pay for their care, and that's a real anxiety that people have. The provisions around that, the kind of legal framework around that, sets out certain circumstances under which the house cannot be counted as part of the person's capital, and that would include things like where the house continues to be occupied by that person's partner or spouse. So if somebody's married or have a partner, a civil partner, then the house is disregarded if the other person still occupies it. Or if it's occupied by a relative aged 60 or over, there's a definition of what relative means. It's quite broad. Or if it's occupied by a child under 16 who the resident in the care home is still liable to maintain. And there are some other circumstances like temporary disregards for 12 weeks property disregard. But there's also some discretionary power, and Health and Social Care Partnership can disregard the value of a property in certain circumstances. And one of the most often common circumstances is where someone has given up their own property or tenancy to move somewhere else in order to care for someone. And not many people know that or necessarily would know how to go about asking for that.
That certainly for me has never ever been mentioned. It's just always been that, how much is the house worth?
Okay. I'm also quite interested in something Joanna said there, which was having at the back of your mind the anxiety about what happens if your mum stops self-funding, and whether or not there would be an expectation that she would need to move to another care home because they only had a limited number of publicly funded places. Mm-hmm. And was that ever discussed with the care home? Was social work involvement? Did anybody ever talk to you about the length of time your mum might be self-funding and what would happen at the point that her capital fell below the limit that she would be self-funding?
It wasn't discussed actually. It was this kind of, can your mum fund her place for at least 2 years, which she could, and it wasn't really discussed. I was aware just because of chatting to other relatives within the care home, and for me, it was an issue that, I say, mum was in the care home for 27 months, and therefore it wasn't an issue that arisen. I could see beyond, for another year, then that would be something that would start to kind of impact, but we weren't at that kind of stage, and we didn't have to deal with it because she died. But I was very aware of that situation in relation to some of the other residents, and talking to kind of families who were quite distressed. Now, you obviously don't know the full circumstances for other people, but I was certainly aware of one person in my mum's unit where that discussion had been around, and she moved to a different care home. Mm-hmm. Now, and I certainly was aware of that situation arising for somebody else, that they were kind of very anxious, and they were in discussions with the managers and with the owners of the care home about that, and knew also that the changes that there had been within the area, and in fact the home didn't any longer take people who were funded by the local authority. Mm. So there had been a change in the time that mum was there that kind of impacted. But no, there wasn't really any discussion. And I say, at the point mum went into the care home, we had a kind of initial kind of review and assessment, which I had to initiate and kind of say this should be done. And it was then basically over to you. So yeah, it's how would you know? When is the point to seek help?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the fact that someone makes a decision to move into a care home is asked to confirm that they will remain self-funding at certain rates for a particular period of time, then it follows for me that the most obvious conversation that then happens next is, well, what happens after that? People shouldn't be going through that period of time anxious about, well, what happens at the end of this? Am I going to have to move home if I cannot then remain self-funding? Mm-hmm. Or will I use the remaining part of my capital that otherwise would have been disregarded in order to continue to self-fund? And the truth is, I think that is a responsibility of the Health and Social Care Partnership and the care home. That conversation should be taking place right at the beginning to say, here's what will happen and here's what would happen at the end of that period. And actually, the length of time that somebody self-funds shouldn't be determined by an agreement like that. It should be determined by the financial assessment. So if somebody goes through a full financial assessment and it's clear, based on the level of income and capital that they have, that they would be self-funding, if they are indeed self-funding, say for 18 months, then why someone should then be asked to sign an agreement that goes longer than that 12 months seems to me to negate the reason why you would have a financial assessment in the first place. Because a financial assessment is there to determine what help they need and when they should be self-funding and when they're not self-funding. And there should be a conversation, I think, right at the outset to say, here's what you can expect and here's what will happen at the end of that, because you should be clear that somebody would cease to become self-funding and that the Health and Social Care Partnership would then be negotiating with the care home around what you've just described there, where you're aware of examples where people have had to move. That's people who are a real casualty of a system that wrapped around commissioning and how we pay for care is letting people fall through cracks. And the fact that someone, after settling in a care home, has to move somewhere else, that idea of choice, and there being a market for care homes.
It's not a market. It's not a true market. No. Because the reality is you have very little choice, particularly because you're going to take into account things like how easy is it going to be for me to visit and things like that. So you've got a limit kind of around that. And the reality is, once you have placed somebody and if you are happy with the care, you're not going to start looking for somewhere else because you might get a better rate, which I might do for my electricity or whatever kind of thing at the end of the year. right, can I get a better deal kind of idea. That, you know, I don't need to do anything significant other than changing supplier. But you're not going to do that, so it's not a true market. And the reality is you're also making decisions when you're not in the best frame of mind, where you would normally say to people, you shouldn't be making significant decisions when there's that level of stress and distress around in terms of doing that. So
the thing. Most people end up, not most people, but you know, a lot of people with dementia end up in that crisis situation, and that's when you're dealing with those very difficult situations, isn't it?
And I think particularly when it's a hospital discharge, because very often I think the crisis is you kind of end up in hospital, whether that's because somebody's had a fracture or kind of whatever, and then it's like you don't need hospital care any longer, you know, and kind of move, and you're under an enormous time pressure in terms of trying to move somebody because of the way the system works. And so for me, it feels as though the person's lost in the middle of that. The person with dementia is just a thing to be moved, which is, I think, enormously difficult. So there are things within the whole system which just are not person-centred.
The financial assessment process isn't, and that whole issue about paying for care is just part of a whole mix of dynamics, isn't it? That makes that such a difficult time. I think one of the things I often hear is that because people do move sometimes very quickly, either from hospital or from home because of crisis, that the financial assessment process starts at that point and can go on for some time. So that the person may be in care for 2 or 3 months before you actually know what the outcome of that financial assessment is going to be, and before you get the first invoice, which means when you get the first invoice, it could be a whopper.
Yeah.
And very little explanation around actually how was that arrived at. Is that something you recognise? Mm-hmm.
And our first bill for Mum, they had forgotten that she was self-funding, so we got a very nice bill through. I obviously had to let them know this. I don't think this is right, but there was a huge difference between what she would have been had she not been self-funding. So.
And the other thing for us, we had to pay a deposit for care. So we had, I think if I remember rightly, it was kind of 4 weeks in advance. And it was something, I mean, it's just it's a minor thing, but it was after Mum had died and I was kind of sorting out the finances, and I suddenly remembered that we'd paid a deposit, and therefore actually that's something that should be refunded, and kind of went chasing up, and then that was a few £1,000s. But when you think about it, it's like it could easily be lost, because I say in the trauma of dealing with somebody's affairs and somebody dying, they're not always the things that you kind of think about. And I say for me, it was just I was doing something else, and I kind of, there was a deposit. We paid some money in advance. But that's, you know, and it came from Mum's resources. It wasn't from my resources. But the reality is that if you're making decisions under stress and in a really short time scale, those kind of things are really difficult to deal with. And do you say yes or no? And if you say no, does that mean you're not going to get a place?
Yeah. I think the other thing is that Joanna mentioned about lack of choice, and we live in quite a rural area, so there is only one nursing home. There's one nursing home and a couple of residential homes. So we were in the situation where when Mum had a really bad fall in the residential home, she then needed nursing care. There wasn't anywhere suitable. The nursing home that she's in now, actually, she had been in there previously and had a very bad experience. However, it's new management now, so it's a very different story. But we really didn't want her going back there at that point, having been through such a tremendous experience with her before. So she then ended up in the specialist dementia unit, and you know, needed that specialist dementia unit because she'd failed so many other places. But even though the decision was made that she needed that care, and that was the best place for her, it was made very clear from the onset that this won't be forever, that she will need to go into nursing care. So, you know, she'd lasted sort of nearly a year in there, but actually the nursing care that she gets now, it far supersedes what she was getting in that specialist dementia unit. So
Mum's had a few moves in the last.
She's had too many moves. Yeah, she's had too many moves.
And I think the crazy thing also for me, it was Mum had a very extended stay in a specialist dementia unit, which had difficulties of its own. Didn't actually cost her anything. But the reality was, it was at the point her dementia had advanced and she was more settled and less of a, and I'll put this in inverted commas, management issue, that she could move. And it was at that very point that she actually then had to pay for care. She had really good quality nursing care in the care home she moved to. Don't have any issues whatsoever about that. But that was the point she had to pay. And there's something illogical about that system, about when that happens.
And that, well, I mean, you're both very familiar with it, but as you know, that's the essence of the Fair Dementia Care campaign, that people who have advanced dementia have primarily very complex health and nursing care needs that sometimes are not always met, but not only that they are asked to pay for that. And we don't normally ask people who are living with other progressive and terminal illnesses and to be paying for care, but people with dementia are definitely disproportionately affected by that, and that's the essence of it. There is some good news and or at least some positive developments. As you know, the independent review of adult social care has made recommendations to abolish all non-residential care social charges, and has also made recommendations which would see a substantial increase in free personal nursing care, which, if according to the report, is implemented in that way, would be round about doubling the level of free personal nursing care, and that's welcome. But we are, of course, are talking about some of the wider issues around that. So whether or not does that go far enough? Does that address some of the inequities, particularly I think for those who are paying the most through those self-funding? Are they protected by that? There is some recommendations, of course, in that report which look about ethical commissioning. So some positive developments about the future that brings us closer, but I think we need to be really involved in those discussions. And of course, some of the other issues that we're talking about today go beyond that issue about paying for care, or rather about what people pay, but actually how it's done and the processes and information and the support that people get. People have a real lack of clarity about how has this been done, why am I paying what I'm paying, how long do I have to pay this, what happens at the end of the period where I'm no longer able to continue to self-fund, am I going to have to move? Those questions should all be laid out right at the start and should be responded and answered at the start. People should know exactly what's going to happen and when. So there are issues, as you know, Fair Dementia Care is about ensuring that people don't pay for healthcare needs, and I think we need to continue to make that case and work with what those recommendations are. But we, of course, are saying we don't currently, as they are, think they go quite far enough. And I think some of what we've talked about today explores some of that. So I think we're probably coming to the end of our time. Can I just ask you one final question, and that would be, what would make a difference for you in all of that? What do you think would have been better, or what could have been done better?
The whole process is just so unfair. It's very unfair. As you say, 1 minute they're deemed to need complete nursing care, and then suddenly, oh well, it's okay that she's fallen and broken her hip, so she's stuck in a chair now, so she can go off to the nursing home. Just as unfair. Mum was in residential home for 10 months, and during that 10 months had 11 accidents, 3 serious accidents requiring hospital. So she wasn't getting the care that she was paying for. So it's very sad, and there's so many in that similar situation. You hear stories all the time about people with dementia in a bad way.
You make a point there about the care that people are paying for, and even we talk about people who are self-funding or those that get public funding, but those people who are public funding get a contribution. They still pay. They are still making a substantial contribution towards the care. Nobody gets care in a care home free. So if you're assessed as needing care in a care home, general rule is you're going to be paying something for it, and it'll be the financial assessment that will determine how much you pay and indeed whether you're self-funding. But everybody is paying for care, and everybody deserves that to be acknowledged, actually, that they are making a financial contribution towards care.
I think it is about better information. And it's a conversation that people don't want to have in advance and think it won't ever happen to them, but actually happens to lots of us, and it comes as a kind of shock. And for me, the thing is about a better understanding, because if you have a better understanding, you're in a better situation to argue for a person. You're in a better situation to be clear what your rights are and what it is. But I think there's not enough information, and therefore when people are kind of confronted with it, then, and it is in that kind of panic, then they're not able to make the best choices, and they're not able to think it through. So it's almost like raising awareness in the public of what it means, because yes, like my family are in England, and lots of them think care is free in Scotland, and care is not free. There's an element that you get a contribution for, but it's not free, and it's about that public understanding, because if there's a better understanding, then things can change because people recognise what the issue is.
Okay, thank you. I totally agree with that. I think there's a lack of transparency, complexity, and a really difficult process at an extremely difficult time. I think there has to be a much better understanding of that, and making that process better, easier understood, giving people the right information. There is, of course, lots of sources of information around about this, but that doesn't necessarily mean in that moment people know where that is or how to get that. So can I just thank you both so much for giving up your time today to have a chat with me. Yes, thank you. And we've only scratched the surface of a really complex subject, but maybe we need to revisit it. But thank you.